The attack at Fort Sumter in April of 1861 remains one of the most important single events in American history. This is, of course, due to the fact that it was the opening battle of the American Civil War. Now, of course, at the time in 1861, newspapers were how people got their information. And so, for our discussion this week, as we look through newspapers, we know that there were many millions of eyes on these newspaper headlines. So I have three selections of newspapers here. The first one comes from the Baltimore Sun, and according to our database, the Baltimore Sun was a newspaper that had a lot of different articles about the battle at Fort Sumter. It was one that I kept having to kind of scroll through to find something that was not from the Baltimore Sun because it had a lot. And this has this fascinating discussion of the surrender at Fort Sumter. So first, it discusses Colonel Wigfall, he was an aide to General Beauregard, who of course was on the forefront there at Fort Sumter, and of course becomes a very prominent Confederate general. At his commander's request, he goes to Fort Sumter with a white flag. Right, of course, Fort Sumter is an island, right? So he has to literally paddle his way over there with his men. He offers to help them extinguish the flames because at this point, and this article, I should note, was written and published on April 15th, which is just 2 days after the hostilities, which took place over the night of April 12th into the morning of April 13th of 1861. So he approached the burning fortress from Morris Island. So Morris Island, another island in Charleston Harbor. There, if you look at the geography of Charleston Harbor, really quite interesting. A lot of different islands. Of course, Fort Sumter being the one of the more prominent. And while the firing was raging on all sides, affecting a landing at Fort Sumter, he approached a porthole and was met by Major Anderson, who was the major in charge of the fort for the Union, who informed him that he had just displayed a white flag, but the firing from the Carolina batteries was kept up nevertheless. Colonel Wigfall replied that Anderson must haul down the American flag. No parley would be granted. Surrender or fight was the word. Major Anderson then hauled down his flag and displayed only the flag of truce. All firing instantly ceased, and two others of General Beauregard's staff, ex Senator Chestnut and ex Governor Manning, then proceeded in a boat, stipulated with the major that his surrender would be unconditional for the present, subject to the terms of arranged with General Beauregard. Really fascinating. So you always wonder, because of course Fort Sumter is an island. You always wonder kind of how that went down. And this newspaper article here from the Baltimore Sun on April 15th of 1861 gives us that exact story. Now our next one here is from the Observer, which is in the United Kingdom. Of course, the UK. You can only imagine. I always imagine that the people, especially more prominent individuals who may remember the Revolutionary era or maybe the War of 1812. I imagine that there was some smirks from those individuals when they found out um, that civil war had broken out in the United States. So this article is quite interesting from the Observer. The Observer quotes both the New York Times and the New York Herald, and this is a description given by the New York Herald that, as you can imagine, many thousands, if not millions, of people in the United Kingdom would have read. Excuse me. Civil War has begun. General Beauregard, in accordance with instructions received Wednesday from the Secretary of War of the Southern Confederacy, showing that instructions, according to the Observer, instructions had come down from the War Department in order to attack Fort Sumter. 27 minutes after 4 o'clock, attacked Fort Sumter, Fort Johnson, and Fort Moultrie, the Iron Battery at Cummings Point, and Stevens Floating Battery. So these are all the different batteries that ended up firing on Fort Sumter. The damage done to Fort Sumter during the past night, the damage done had been, up to the accounts, considerable. Guns had been dismounted, and a part of the parapet was swept away. And he discusses how Major Anderson kept up the fight. It's a really quite interesting thing. And this next last article here is from the New York Times. It's from May 21st of 1861. So as you can see, this the attack at Fort Sumter was a story in the papers for quite some time. And this describes how the men in Fort Sumter, the state that they were in, when the bombardment commenced, they were entirely out of bread, rice, etc. Their stock supplies consisted only of a few days of rations of salted meat and coffee. The fire was opened to them at 4:30 a.m., battery after battery joining in the murderous attack. The major took it very calmly, Major Anderson, divided his men into companies to relieve each other, and their scanty breakfast is the word. It's a little, of course, a little Being a very old newspaper, it's a little hard to read. But their scanty breakfast prepared, which they partook in silence while the iron hull was crashing against their walls, prepared additional cartridges of tearing up the flannel shirts of the men, their bedclothes, got out of supply of powder to the magazine, and after nearly 4 hours of silence, the fort at last opened most vigorously of their assaults. So you can imagine they're eating breakfast while they hear cannon just battery balls just knocking against the walls of Fort Sumter. A fascinating story indeed.